I am Chad Pivito, Assistant Professor of Religion. This is Noah Silverman, a consultant from the Interfaith Youth Corps. We brought him down here in part because we're at the tail end of a lot of talks and planning to be able to launch, we've now proposed and in the process of working through the committees, the process of proposal for an interfaith leadership minor. We also have possible interfaith leadership certificate in the works, and hopefully even being able to deliver some certificates and for continuing education credits for working professionals in interfaith leadership. So we brought Noah down here because he is an expert in this field. Interfaith Youth Corps is the gold standard, really, in interfaith work in the United States today. It was founded by Eboo Patel, whom we brought to campus in 2016. So Noah is the bookend of that. He is the Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships, and he's been doing this sort of work for over a decade. He got started in this work while you were living in Jerusalem, and working on helping the situation there. So you might ask him about that.
There's more work to do.
There's more work to do still. He also is a father of 2 kids, one of whom is a newborn. So we're very happy he's here and appears mildly well rested. We're very thankful for that. So with no further ado.
Great.
Noah.
Thanks. Can folks hear me okay? Yep, great. So I think the way we're going to structure this is I'm going to start by sharing some thoughts on sort of why I think this work, interfaith leadership, interfaith literacy, is important in sort of a macro sense. And actually, that part I think will be, geared to everyone, but specifically to the students in the room about why I think this is an important thing for you to focus on during your undergraduate career here at Texas Wesleyan. And then we'll transition to what is a little bit more of what I hope to be a little bit more discussional format around some more of the sort of definitions. What do we mean by interfaith cooperation? What does that look like? How is that distinct from other terms or similar concepts you may have heard? And then we'll talk a little bit more about what it means to approach this from a curricular academic perspective. And again, that should be relevant to everyone, but might be a little bit more germane to the faculty and staff folks in the room. Does that sound good? I will say this is a small and informal setting, so if at any point folks want to get up and get some more food, go right ahead. I won't be bothered. If I said something that doesn't make any sense, just please raise your hand and ask me to clarify. There'll be times for questions, but if I use the term or word or whatever that you didn't follow, feel free to interrupt. We can keep this pretty casual and low key. Sound good? Great. So thank you, Professor Pivito, for inviting me here. As you said, IFYC and Texas Wesleyan have had a relationship that's gone back a few years now, starting with your erstwhile colleague, Mark Hanshaw, who came to a seminar that Interfaith Youth Corps runs every year in Chicago, and Mark was a participant in that and a very active participant. And then I had the great opportunity to work with Mark on a few different projects, including Mark has a chapter in this book that IFYC edited on the growing field of interfaith studies. But this is my first time actually being on campus, so I'm thrilled to be here with all of you. So as some of you are no doubt aware, right now the Jewish community around the world, which is my community, is in the midst of what we call the Days of Repentance. So it's a period that starts with Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, which was last Monday and Tuesday. And it continues until Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, which is next Wednesday. And the somewhat harsh metaphor in the Jewish tradition around this period is that on Rosh Hashanah, on the New Year, God reviews every single human's deeds over the past year, one at a time, and decides who to inscribe in the book of life for the following year, who will survive until next Rosh Hashanah. And there's actually a pretty morbid prayer that we recite on Rosh Hashanah that goes through a litany of all the ways we could die in the next year. I'm not making this up at all. If you ever have the opportunity to visit a synagogue, or if you yourself participate in this. So, who by fire and who by storm, who by murder and who by stoning. I mean, it lists all the different ways that we could die in the next year. And then the focus is around how we can repent in order to prevent that. So the metaphor is that actually God only sort of pencils us in to the book of life on Rosh Hashanah, and that we all have 10 days to basically change God's decree, to repent, to repair the mistakes that we've made, to do better, to commit to righting the wrongs that we've committed. And then on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, it's sealed. The book of life is sealed, and tradition holds whatever's going to happen to you now for the next year is going to happen. So it's kind of a solemn and introspective period in the Jewish calendar, and one that I participate in. But it's always been noteworthy to me that the rituals and the tradition holds that the Day of Atonement, I mean, a lot of the rituals around both holidays are at synagogue, it's a lot of prayer, it's a lot directed toward God. But the liturgy and all the rituals hold that God can actually only forgive us for things that we've done wrong by God, ways that we have failed our obligations to God. The ways that we failed each other, the things that we've done to other human beings, which is a far bigger category, the God and the Day of Atonement cannot atone for, cannot rectify for, until we have ourselves done the work of seeking the people out that we have wronged and making things right with them. So there's a prayer that we recite on Yom Kippur that says, for wrongs committed against God, the Day of Atonement atones. For wrongs committed against our fellow human beings, the Day of Atonement cannot atone until we have done the work ourselves. So there's a widespread tradition that during this period, in addition to doing your own sort of introspection and reflection on how you can be a better person in general, you actually have to seek out all the people in your life and apologize and seek their forgiveness for all the things, all the ways that you might have wronged them. And there's sort of more and less formulaic ways of doing this. There's a notion that we wrong people sometimes intentionally and we wrong people sometimes unintentionally. We wrong people through our deeds, through our actions, and we wrong people through our lack of action, through not doing things. And that we have to be attentive and intentional about repairing all of that. So it's a powerful message, and it's one that I am religiously obligated to think about at least once a year. I would like to think I think about it more frequently than that. But the question that it asks for me is, what do I owe my fellow humans? How do I do right by them? How do I do right by you in this room? And I think these are really profoundly hard questions, and I think they're made especially hard by the dizzying diversity of the world in which we all now inhabit. Because crucial to the Jewish tradition is it's not that I'm only obligated to right my relationships with other Jews, I'm obligated to right my relationship with everyone, with every other human being with whom I've come into contact in the past year. And most of those people obviously are not Jewish. They don't believe the same things that I do. They have very different notions of actually what doing right means. So for some people, doing right by them might be preserving a woman's right to choose. For other people, doing right by them might be protecting unborn children's right to life. We actually, in this community, in the United States, have very radically, oppositionally different opinions of what doing right by each other means. And I, for one, and I would suggest probably all of us in our own ways, have a responsibility to do right by people, to try and live in right relationship with the communities that we find ourselves in, the community of Texas Wesleyan, the community of our religious or philosophical or secular tradition, the community of the United States, the community of the world. We have an obligation to do right by each other, but what that means is not so readily clear or so readily available. So I think part of the answer to trying to figure out how to navigate that, of trying to figure out how to do right by the diversity of the world in your life, is in what I'm going to call interfaith literacy, which is the skills and the knowledge of the diversity of ways of being in the world, primarily around questions of religious and secular and philosophical identity. And the disposition to enact them is what I'm going to call interfaith leadership. The willingness to say, I'm going to learn about the diversity of the world around me, and I'm going to, through my life and through my action, I'm going to try and live in right relationship with all these folks. That's what I'm calling interfaith leadership. And so I'm going to offer 4 reasons why I think that set of skills and that disposition is an especially important thing for you to learn in your relatively short amount of time here at Texas Wesleyan. So again, this is primarily geared at the students, but obviously other folks play a role in teaching and instilling these values and this knowledge. So why is acquiring interfaith literacy a uniquely valuable skill for the 21st century? My first answer is that regardless of your personal orientation around religion, whether you happen to be religious or atheist or agnostic or spiritual but not religious, I don't think you can call yourself an educated person in today's world if you remain ignorant about the world's religious traditions. I'm just going to put that out there. If you don't know anything about other religious traditions, I don't think you can call yourself educated anymore. So last spring, we woke up to learn about a devastating terrorist attack in Sri Lanka, where over 300 people were killed while attending Easter services in church. And pretty shortly thereafter, ISIS, the Islamic State, claimed responsibility for this terrorist attack. And yet, for the first 24 to 48 hours of news coverage around the attack, everyone, all the sort of Western journalists who were trying to explain this to a Western audience were focusing on the history of the civil war in Sri Lanka, which was primarily between Sinhalese Buddhist and Tamil Hindu communities. Actually, two completely different communities that were involved in this attack. There's an Islamist attack in Christian churches, and yet Western journalism immediately reached for, oh, well, there was religious conflict there, it must all be the same thing. Quite frankly, the Western news media knew too little about the religious dynamics of Sri Lanka to effectively explain or interpret events that were happening in real time. So it took almost a week before Western news media was able to catch up to, okay, this is the actual dynamics that are at play, here are the communities who are really involved. There were just too few journalists in Western media who understood the religious traditions and the ethnic communities that were involved in this attack. And this isn't just a problem with journalists. It's a problem with diplomats and foreign policy officials as well. So Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State in the 1990s, after she was done, she wrote a book called The Mighty and the Almighty. And she discusses in the book that when she was Secretary of State in the 1990s, so this is a period after the end of the Cold War, which I realize for some of the students in the room is like history now, which is kind of strange, but there was a global rise in identity-based conflict all over the world, from the Balkans to Israel-Palestine to South Asia. And Madeleine Albright had at her disposal like literally hundreds of specialists who could talk about trade relations and economic development in all over the world, and she had precisely 0 people on staff who could help her understand the religious dynamics that were playing out around the world. There was literally no one in the State Department in the 1990s who was a specialist in religion. And this was during a time when the Prime Minister of Israel is assassinated by a Jewish fundamentalist, when Al-Qaeda is first being formed, right? So before we had ISIS, we had Al-Qaeda, so the rise of Islamic terrorism. There was no one in the State Department who had any knowledge or understanding of what this was about. So much so that when John Kerry then became Secretary of State, he founded a specific office in the State Department to study and to bring specialists on world affairs. And he said when he was inaugurating the office, that if he were to go back to college today, I mean, this was now however many years ago, he would major in comparative religion because that's how central it is to the job that he's being tasked with doing as Secretary of State. So closer to home, I don't know how any of us make sense of some of the recent controversies involving Representative Omar in Congress. Folks followed any of this or heard about it, right? So the irony of the fact that one of the first Muslim congresswomen is being taken to task for deploying distinctly Christian anti-Semitic tropes against Jews is like seemingly lost on most of our fellow citizens. So we're engaged in this national political debate about what constitutes anti-Semitism, what is the proper role of religious affiliation in government and in foreign affairs, but nobody really seems to know very much about what they're actually talking about. But perhaps national and international politics aren't like where your interests lie. Perhaps you're interested in being a lawyer. So we were just talking a little bit about religion, mindfulness in the criminal justice system. It's interesting to note that, God forbid, any of you should be convicted and serve a prison sentence. If you want to request an exemption to a mandate that exists in most prisons around facial hair, you're not allowed to have it. You cannot claim an exemption on the basis of your racial identity, your gender identity, your sexual orientation, your class, any of those things. No, it will be denied. But if you claim an exemption to any actual federal regulation on the basis of your religious identity, the Supreme Court will back you in a 9-0 vote that you have the right to do that. So for those of you who pay attention, the Supreme Court rarely decides anything 9-0 anymore. 9-0, prisoners are allowed to grow beards because of their religious identity. So religious identity has a special and unique status in the American jurisprudence system that is not afforded to any other kind of identity. It's centrally important to how our legal system works. If you want to be a lawyer, you need to understand something about religious identity. Simply put, you cannot consider yourself an educated person if you remain ignorant about religion or religious diversity. So that's my first reason. My second reason is that it's a pragmatic career skill. So I've already mentioned how if you're interested in going into the foreign service or into government or into law, you need to know something about religious diversity. But it's equally relevant for any other profession you might pursue. So I know that Texas Wesleyan has a really strong healthcare school, and that a lot of you might be thinking about going into health professions. So the United States, by some estimates, is the most religiously diverse society since the Roman Empire. So just let that sit in for a moment. There has been no other society in human history, arguably since the entire Roman Empire, that has had as many different religious communities or sub-communities living side by side as the current United States. So it depends a little bit on how you slice it, right? If you're talking about proportionality, we're still overwhelmingly Christian and now increasingly secular. But in terms of representation of different religious groups, the United States is the most religiously diverse society, arguably in human history. If you go into the health professions, guess who is going to show up at your hospital or your clinic or your office? The entire religious diversity of the world. And if there's one thing that's pretty central to most religious traditions, it's notions of life and death and how to treat the body. It might help you, it might behoove you to know something about the religious diversity of the patients that you'll be treating in your job. So there's this amazing book called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. Has anybody heard of this book? Chad has, yeah. So it's a book about it's a medical history of a case in California a decade or so ago of the Lee family. And Leah Lee, who was a daughter in the family, started having seizures. And so they took her to the local hospital to treat the seizures. Now, it's central to the story that the Lee family are Hmong shamans. So the Hmong community is a community from Vietnam that actually sided with the United States in the Vietnam War. And then when that went badly for us, they got a special refugee status and immigrated en masse to the United States, and they practice a form of shamanism. So when Leah, their daughter, started having seizures, they bring her into the hospital, and the doctors recognize that this is a form of epilepsy, and they start giving her all sorts of treatment to treat the seizures. But what they don't know and don't appreciate is that in the Hmong shaman tradition, seizures are a sign that you're receiving visions from the spiritual world. And it's frequently a precursor to becoming a shaman, to becoming a religious leader in this community. So while the Lees were appropriately concerned about their daughter's health, they also recognized the spiritual significance of what was happening and wanted to be appropriately attuned to it. And the medications that the Western doctors were giving her not only removed the seizures and thus, in the Lee parents' mind, her connection to the spiritual plane, but they also had all sorts of other side effects that were never explained to the Lee family due to various cultural and language barriers. So the Lee family stopped administering the drugs. They stopped giving her the treatment because they didn't understand what it was doing to her, and as far as they did understand it, it was preventing something that they thought to be profound and of importance. And ultimately, this is an entire book. Ultimately, Leah dies. The doctors try and actually call DCFS to remove her from her parents' care because in their understanding, she's like being, this is not malpractice, but that negligence on the part of the parents. And so they try and remove her from her parents. Ultimately, she dies. The author of the book, Ann Fadiman, notes that on the original intake form for Lee into the hospital, in the box, on the category and family history, on the box marked religion, they had checked none. There was simply just no understanding in the California medical system at the time about Hmong shamanism. And so therefore, there could be no attempt at trying to cross this religious or cultural divide. It wasn't on their radar map that Hmong shamanism is a thing, and so they didn't think they needed to devote any resources in trying to understand or communicate across that gap. Now, I'm not saying that if you want to be a nurse or a doctor, you need to know the intricacies of Hmong shamanism. I don't know the intricacies of Hmong shamanism. But I think the more we have healthcare professionals who know something about the religious diversity of the world and know something about the need to ask about the religious diversity of their patients, the greater likelihood that in cases like Leah's go better, that there is more communication, that there's more understanding that transpires between medical professionals and their patients. So 2 more quick examples in this category of professional relevance. A few years ago, a player for the Kansas City Chiefs, I heard you guys just restart, or not just, but a couple years ago restarted your football program. So a couple years ago, a player for the Kansas City Chiefs scored a touchdown, got to the end zone, and then dropped to both knees and touched his head to the grass. And the NFL referee quickly flew a flag because the NFL had just passed a rule about no showboating after scoring a touchdown and took the touchdown back. Changed the course of the game. Said this touchdown is invalid because this player is showboating. Now, of course, as is frequently the case in American policy, there's an exemption to that NFL policy, and the exemption is for prayer. So if you drop to one knee in the end zone and offer a prayer, that's totally allowed. Well, what the referee didn't realize is that when Hussein Abdullah scores a touchdown and drops to both knees and touches his head to the grass, he is performing Muslim salat. He is performing a prayer, which is totally allowed by NFL rules. But the NFL referee just didn't know what he was seeing. Literally just did not recognize Muslim prayer. Had never seen it before, didn't recognize that's what was happening, takes the touchdown back. One more example. I was recently talking to someone who works as a consultant for, this is like the most specific thing, a company that consults with oil companies around cleaning up oil spills. So we all know like oil spills happen in various parts of the world. His job is to work with oil companies to figure out how to clean up the oil spills. He'd just gone back from Kuwait, where they're still cleaning up the oil spills from the Gulf War, which again I realize is like ancient history for some people in the room. And I asked him, so what was it like, spending a month in Kuwait? And the first thing he said is, I wish I knew more about Islam before I went. I couldn't function because I just did not know enough, I didn't know anything about the culture and the society in which I was going to be living for 2 months. So my point being, if everyone from doctors and nurses to oil industry professionals to NFL referees need to know something about religious diversity in order to do their jobs well. I mean, this isn't even like to be a good person, just to do your job well. I imagine that whatever field you're going to go into, you're going to need to know something about religious diversity. So the third reason that I want to offer you for why this is an important thing to focus on in your undergraduate careers is quite simply meaning making. So it's a whole set of questions about figuring out how to do your job well. It's another set of questions about figuring out how to figure out what to do with your life and what meaning to make out of it. And I think that actually the study of religious diversity and interfaith engagement can be hugely helpful for that. So the great Jewish rabbi and scholar Hillel the Elder famously, so this is someone who lived around the time of Jesus, and he famously asks 3 questions of all of his students. Im ein ani li mili. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? Ukshe ma ani. If I'm only for myself, who am I? V'im lo akshav emaitai. And if not now, then when? So obviously I'm a little bit partial to my own tradition, but I actually think these are 3 of the most important questions for undergraduates to be asking themselves during their career. The first question, who are you? How do you define and understand yourself? What traditions and ideas form and shape you? I imagine you are encountering a lot of those ideas right now in your classes, in your dorm rooms, on the football field. Which ones of those do you want to assimilate into your character and who you're going to be for the rest of your life? How do you have enough of a sense of yourself to navigate the complexity and diversity of the world without being blown over by it? Second question, how are you going to treat others? What do you do with all these other people out there with whom you have to interact on a daily basis? Third question, what are you going to do with your life? What impact are you going to have with this preciously short amount of time that you have on this planet? I believe that answering these 3 questions is the stepping stone to creating a worldview. And I'll say again that it doesn't matter whether this worldview is religious or not, whether you consider yourself secular or religious but not spiritual, spiritual but not religious, I don't care. Having a sense of identity and purpose is central to being human, and I think the study of religion and religious diversity and how to engage with people who come from different worldviews and traditions than your own is central to figuring these questions out. Fourth reason, tradition. So whether you're aware of it or not, you are part of a long history and tradition of interfaith cooperation and religious diversity in this country, and I want to suggest that you have some responsibility to carry it forward. So religion, as I've already touched on a little bit, is the dynamic of human identity that our founding fathers actually got closest to getting right. So those like straight white male slaveholders who screwed up a whole number of other things actually thought really hard about religious identity and were remarkably advanced for their time, right? So they create a constitution that bars the federal government from establishing a church or a single religious identity, that prevents any test of faith or religion for holding public office, that guarantees religious freedom, and from the very earliest beginnings of the country was adamant about protecting the religious diversity of the early colonists in the early America. So one of the first Jewish communities in North America was in Rhode Island. And after the Constitution was ratified and we won the Revolutionary War and George Washington gets elected president, the president of the synagogue in Rhode Island writes George Washington a letter and basically says, look, my people have been harassed and persecuted throughout all of Europe, throughout all of time. How are you going to treat us here? Like, just let me know. Like, what's the story going to be here? And George Washington writes back, the government of the United States shall give to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. George Washington, from the beginning, was acutely aware of how important it was to create a society where all religious traditions had freedom to live out their creed. Do you know which president had the first iftar at the White House? So iftar is the Muslim celebration. So during the month of Ramadan, Muslims fast from sunrise to sunset, and then at sunset they eat a celebratory meal called iftar. Which president do you think had the first explicitly Muslim iftar in the White House? Anybody want to guess? Thomas Jefferson. Good job. Yeah. So Thomas Jefferson was hosting the ambassador from the Ottoman Empire, quickly learned what Ramadan was, learned that there was an iftar, delayed all his meetings till after sunset, and insisted on hosting the Ottoman Empire's ambassador for iftar at the White House. From the earliest days, this was central to part of what it meant to be the United States. Much more recently, it's worth paying attention to the manner in which the movements that have sought to expand and realize the freedoms enshrined in the Constitution were animated by interfaith relationships. So we're all pretty familiar, I imagine, with the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Fewer of us are familiar with the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. MLK famously said once that people want to make of me many things, but in the deepest recesses of my heart, I'm a Baptist preacher because my daddy was a Baptist preacher, and his daddy was a Baptist preacher, and his daddy was a Baptist preacher. The Civil Rights Movement was a movement that was organized by and through religious communities across interfaith boundaries. So Martin Luther King, studying in Crozier Seminary, hears Mordecai Johnson give a speech about Gandhi as the epitome of Christian love. And King, who had never heard of Gandhi before, never heard of Hinduism before, starts reading deeply into Gandhi's writings and realizes that what he sees in Gandhi's notion of satyagraha, of truth force or love force, is Jesus' imperative to love thy neighbor. And he realizes for the first time that this is an ethic that goes beyond interpersonal relationships to an actual social force. And when he's elected to the head of the Montgomery bus boycott movement, he literally says in a meeting, we're going to go Gandhi on this town. And I'm sure nobody had any idea what he was talking about. But he leads this nonviolent movement, the Montgomery bus boycott, right? We all know this story, out of his inspiration and respect for how Gandhi, a Hindu, had taken a notion that King recognized in his own Christian faith and used it as a tool for social change. Then later, King was invited to go speak on the National Conference on Religion and Race in Chicago, as was someone named Abraham Joshua Heschel, who had literally just escaped the Holocaust in Europe. Much of his family was slaughtered. He makes it to the United States. He goes to this conference, he hears King talk about the civil rights movement, and if there was anybody who had any right to be like, you know what, I'm looking after my own now, Heschel says, this is the Hebrew prophets alive today. It is our moral obligation to participate in the civil rights movement, and drags the Jewish community from the north, from cities like New York and Boston, Chicago, down to the march from Selma and Montgomery, and says, this is the highest form of prayer. Participating in this march is the highest form of prayer. So we are part of a long tradition of interfaith relationships that have sought to accomplish perhaps the most daunting and ambitious goal in human history, which is to figure out how to live together when we have very different notions of what it means to live together. So political philosophers, like going all the way back, have always said that if you wanted democracy, you had to have homogeneity. Because Otherwise, why would any one group allow the other group to elect their leader to be in charge of you? If you wanted diversity, you had to have a dictatorship. That's the way it had to be. If you wanted democracy, you needed to have homogeneity. The two things couldn't exist, diversity and democracy. And Michael Walzer, who's a famous political philosopher, writes a book on what it means to be American. He's discussing this history of political philosophy, and he ends the chapter with the line, "Until the United States." We are literally the first human society that has tried to do this. Now, many others are, obviously, but to try to figure out how do we live together in a democratic society where we all get to have our own opinion, we all get to express it, we all get to run for office, we all get to vote for whomever we want for office, with our radically different notions of what it means to be human, of what it means to treat each other correctly, of what justice is, of what right relationship is. It's an amazing accomplishment, and it is persistently and currently under threat. So I would like to suggest that you, as the inheritors of that tradition, all of us as the inheritors of that tradition, have some responsibility, not just to mind our own business and stay out of the way, but to actively participate in it, to actively continue it on to the next generation, to actively take the charge of what it means to live in a society where everybody gets to be who they are, including to be completely theologically, epistemologically, morally wrong, and still live together peacefully, cooperatively, interactively. So this Wednesday on Yom Kippur, I will be in synagogue, and one of the rituals on Yom Kippur is we all stand up and we literally beat our chests as we list all the sins that we have committed. And the interesting thing about this ritual is, again, it's a whole litany of things. It does not matter whether I personally have committed that sin or not. The entire community beats its chest because there's an acknowledgement that someone amongst us has done all of these things. Someone has lied, someone has stolen, someone has slandered, someone has committed adultery, someone has cheated, someone has used words to disparage others, and we all beat our chests. The notion of Yom Kippur is that we are responsible to and we are responsible for the broader community. And what I would like to suggest to you is that you are as well, for the broader American community and this very fragile thing called a religiously diverse democracy, and that interfaith cooperation and interfaith literacy are skills and dispositions that can help you do that, and it's worthwhile to take some time to study it in college. So thanks. You don't have to clap. I will pause there mostly because I need to take a drink. Does anybody have any questions about anything that I've said or put forward thus far?
I'll just offer a comment. You talked about how Dr. King was influenced by Gandhi, a Hindu, and Gandhi was influenced by the Jain religion because he was from Gujarat, where it's very strong. So we have a triple hitter right there. See, so. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, the history on this is deep. So Gandhi, first started getting involved in social change in South Africa, right? So he was born in India, actually grew up in South Africa, or didn't grow up, but started his professional career in South Africa, and actually was deeply reading in Christian theology, and picked up on the Sermon on the Mount and all that. Then went back to India, was in conversation with the Jain tradition, and then one of his right-hand allies, was Badsha Khan, who was a Muslim leader who brought the sort of Indian independence movement into what's now modern-day Pakistan, yeah. And then the connections with King and others. Okay, do I have a little bit more of your time and attention? Yeah? Yes, please.
I was just going to ask you if you would share a little bit of your own story, like how you came to not only embrace kind of interfaith leadership kind of as a perspective, right? But challenges, benefits, right? A little bit of your journey around that.
Sure. So I grew up in Chicago, where I now live. I actually live a mile from where I grew up, which is another great irony of my life, but that's a different story. Well, it's actually connected. So I grew up in Chicago. I grew up going to synagogue, going to school, And actually, the message that I got from both those places was very much, so this was like at the height of the diversity service learning movement in the 90s, and so it was like very much this, like, you have a responsibility to go out and serve and give back and get involved in your community. I actually was involved in a lot of work in, I don't know how many people are familiar with Chicago, whatnot, but there's this whole experiment with housing projects in Chicago that did not go very well, so I was involved in various service projects in the Chicago Housing Authority. But then when I was finishing high school, both my parents were academics, and so it was always assumed and expected that I would go to college, so naturally I was determined not to go to college. And I was like very adamant that I wanted to go someplace that was not a college campus and do something that was not being a student. I don't know if this resonates with any of the students in the room, I don't know. But so I entered into a series of negotiations with my parents about what I could do. And basically what we agreed on is I could go spend a year living in Israel, Palestine, because it met my goal of getting very far away from them, and it met their goal of me not spending a year like on their couch doing nothing. And so I like went on this Zionist youth program for young American Jews to spend a year between high school and college, not like out of some like grand Zionist fantasy, but just because it was like very far away from Hyde Park. And I got there and was living on a kibbutz in the Galilee, and for the first time, like really was introduced and fell in love with the notion of Jewish peoplehood, that this was more than just like a set of religious or philosophical statements, which I like gave quasi-assent and some practices that I did, but like actually a sense of belonging and peoplehood and sort of more enveloping identity. And so I was like, great, I'm going to make Aliyah. So that's the term for Jews who move back to Israel. So I was like determined now that I was gonna like make Aliyah and I was gonna move to Israel, and I had found my true calling. And then the program that I was on happened to move us from the kibbutz to Jerusalem. And if any of you have been to Jerusalem, it's like kind of in the hills. And so the different neighborhoods are like different hills. And we were studying at Hebrew University. And the history of Jerusalem, so from 48 to 67, it was a divided city, right? So the western part became part of what's now Israel, and the eastern part at the time was part of Jordan and is now disputed. It's all disputed. But there's this sort of Har HaTzofim, Mount Scopus, which is where Hebrew University is a hill in East Jerusalem, but that what became Israel managed to maintain in the 48 war. So it's a Jewish community that's surrounded by Palestinian communities, is the point. That's where I was living. Because I'd grown up in the diversity service learning movement, I was like, oh, I'm gonna go meet my neighbors. And so I went and met my neighbors, and they were all Palestinians. And I was like, whoa, there's a lot more going on here than I realized. And I immediately decided that I wanted to be Palestinian, because that also seemed amazing. And so I started learning Arabic and spending a lot of time with like new Palestinian friends. And I say this a little tongue-in-cheek because it's kind of funny, but I really at the time did not think that there was anything contradictory about deciding that I wanted to be both Israeli and Palestinian, because I truly felt loyalty to both those stories and both those people, and felt like if they could coexist peacefully in my heart, then they ought to be able to coexist peacefully on this narrow piece of land, and that was just obvious. And obviously, I had this experience where my Palestinian and my Israeli friends started saying to me, like, you gotta choose. Like, you're either with us or with them. You say you understand our story, you say you understand our experience. They are trying to kill us. So you have to choose. And I really just felt at 18 like that was a false choice. Like, I shouldn't have to choose. So the somewhat glib answer is like the rest of my professional career has just been like trying to make that a reality. Obviously it has not gone so well in Israel, Palestine. It's going a little bit better here in North America, but it's still a challenge. But I think, this is something I've done some writing at. I think part of what is unique to growing up in the 21st century is that we have loyalties to multiple communities. We are not just formed by the single the idea of a monoculture is always something of a myth, but that we are formed by multiple people and multiple relationships and multiple communities, and that it is particularly challenging and particularly worthwhile to figure out how to maintain loyalty in relationships with them, and to recognize the ways in which they form us, that I owe things to different people, and those different people don't always agree with each other, and yet I try and be loyal to them both. So that's how I got into this. There's like a more professional answer, which is that I was a college student and I was studying with a professor who was kind enough to be patient and like sort of a mentor for me. And he was working on editing a book with this young upstart interfaith organizer from Chicago, and so brought him to campus. And at the time when Ibu Patel came to campus, like 5 people showed up to the talk, and I was one of the 5. And so I met Ibu as a senior in college and have been along for the ride. So the next section of this is going to be trying to dig in a little bit more into what we mean by interfaith cooperation, who Interfaith Youth Corps is, how we try and pursue that. Sounds good? Okay, great. Okay. Oh, introductions. How the students in the room, you all have until 1, or I'm just going to make an executive decision. I would like to learn a little bit more about who all is in the room. So if folks don't mind just going around, and you can say very briefly, just your name, your role on campus, i.e. I am a junior or senior and I'm studying this, or I teach in this department, or I just was walking by and I saw the free carrot, so I decided to come in. It's totally fine. And if you have a thought on why this might be relevant to you or what brought you into the room, I'd love to hear it, but no excessive pressure on that. Do you mind starting?
My name is Torres Santillan. I'm a junior. I'm in Dr. Kendall's class in ethics, so I guess that would be relevant.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you. Patricia? Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Maya. I'm a freshman, and I'm in Dr. Pevito's World Religion class. And I thought that this would be relevant for me because I want to be in the healthcare, and I'm not sure what I want to do, but I know that I'm going to have patients of all kinds of races, ethnicities, and I just want to know how to properly provide healthcare to them.
Thank you. You mind saying your name?
Maya.
Maya, thank you.
Stand up. Hi, my name is Jacob. I'm a junior here on campus. I'm also in one of Dr. Pivito's religion classes. It applies a little bit, obviously it applies for everyone, for me a little more, particularly because I'm a comparative religion major. And we're working on starting an interfaith leadership program here on campus that I was looking to be a part of, so very relevant to me.
My name is Ryan. I have Dr. Pivito and Dr. Well for class. I'm a senior, a resident here, and I'm still contemplating as to the ins and outs of how this specifically is going to
Totally fair.
be exercised.
I'm Ray. I'm a Dr. Pito and Dr. Williams. Religion is my major, so I'm so interested about that because China is not a religion country, but we have the free religion, and the location religion is not very popular in the world, so I want to learn more about this knowledge.
Thank you.
My name is Fang. My doctor is Dr. Peter and Dr. Will. My major is religion. I like to interesting for religion. My mother and my grandmother is both believe the Buddha like this.
Okay, so I'm Aziz. I'm a psychology and Christian studies major. And so the reason why this is relevant to me is because of the fact that as a counselor, which I want to be in the future, it's important to understand different religious aspects of people because that can also impact how I will try to counsel them. And so if I know it's a religious problem, the way I would come at it, I would probably learn a little bit more so I can meet them where they're at rather than trying to bring them where I am.
My name is Chris. I'm a senior here at Texas Wesleyan. I am a criminal justice major, and I feel like this should be relevant because I plan going into law enforcement after graduation, and I'm going to be interacting with a lot of different people out in the field.
Great, thank you. Sir?
This is me, Dr. Bruce McDonald, and I teach world religions, and I think it's very important to meet people where they are. I think that's it. Did you ever come across Dr. Father Elias Shakur in Israel? He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize twice, and he says, how many of you were born Christian? Well, we didn't know what to say. He said, I don't know about you, but I was born a baby. He's established a school in Galilee for Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and the different representatives of the different faiths take care of a religious ed program, and he's trying to get them to get along as people. Daniel Barenboim, the conductor, is of course Jewish, but he has a Palestinian-Israeli youth orchestra, getting them to get along as people. I can't think of anything worse than a world that's carbon copies of me. Don't agree too quick, please. But I think that, again, treating people as who they are, and I've traveled considerably in Asia, love it, because you get to meet people and find out who they are, where they're from, and make friends with them. That part I think is great.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Terry Kane. I'm the director of the Nursing Anesthesia Program here at Texas Wesleyan. And so, as you mentioned, rightly so, I have in my practice a variety of faith traditions among our patients, just like we have a variety of faith traditions in our students.
Great, thank you.
My name is Carl Smeller. I teach English and Humanities, and so even though religion's not my area of specialty, I'm talking about it all the time.
Right. See ya. Great, thank you.
I'm Chris Elhan. I teach history here, and I teach world history. I've lived all over the world, and I lived in Kuwait, so I know the value of knowing a little bit about the religion and the values where you live.
Gladys Childs, the Dean of Freshmen and the chaplain, and everything I do is relevant to faith and where students come from.
Thank you.
I'm Kevra Weddle, and I am in the religion department, and obviously very excited about seeing how we can integrate more interfaith leadership, not only in our department, but across campus. So we're thrilled that you're here.
You know what? I'm here practically because your appearance is part of a grant that Chad is facilitating for Texas Methodist Foundation. I'm personally interested in it because I was raised Protestant and I converted to Catholicism and very fascinated by this.
Brian, did you say your name?
Oh, I'm still Brian, built from lunch.
Great. I hope that you're able to report that the grant monies were well spent.
Yes.
Hey everybody, Kerry Atkinson, criminal justice, and I guess to kind of boil it down, I'm not sure if justice is possible, you know, in general, but it's certainly not possible without understanding of the ways religious faith influences our notions of morality. So that's probably the reason I'm here.
Great, thank you.
I'm Chad Pivotal. I'll introduce myself again just because in terms of I teach religion. But this is relevant to me. I was an Episcopal youth minister when 9/11 happened. And I was dealing with all these questions of faith that the teenagers had in my care, and those were significant, and I wanted to study those at another level. But 9/11 really made me want to think about things on a much broader level, and just work for resources for how we could help each other get along. So it was after 9/11 that I went to grad school, and now here I am getting to host an event like this. Would you have a new addition?
Please. No, you're right on time.
I'm Heidi Taylor. I'm the Dean for the School of Health Professions. I'm a nurse. My interest in this, I often refer to myself as probably the only Buddhist, Quaker, Hindu on campus. Initially in my office, you know, I have a so. But more importantly, my area of expertise is really in the use of meditation and imagery as a way of tapping into inner wisdom and a deeper spiritual connection in the world. And that's actually my nursing practice, what I do as a nurse. And so I care very much about the role of spirituality in health and healing and well-being.
Okay, so I'm gonna take a few more minutes and just sort of give some definitions about sort of what do I actually specifically mean by interfaith cooperation, et cetera, and then maybe we'll pause again and Q&A, and I know some folks need to leave and whatnot, and then we can take it from there. So, right, so we've covered the importance of interfaith, right? Done, check, that's important. So definitions of foundations. Dr. Pivotal already mentioned this, but Interfaith Youth Corps is the organization for which I work. It was founded by this gentleman, Ibu Patel, in 2002. We're a national nonprofit. We're based in Chicago. We work with over 500 campuses across the country on trying to make interfaith cooperation sort of a norm in higher education, with the belief that by institutionalizing it in that sector, you all will graduate and go on to other places, law enforcement, nursing, what have you, where it will sort of spread to society as a whole. Okay, so I touched on this a little bit, but just the recognition that religious diversity is rapidly increasing everywhere. Robert Putnam, who's a sociologist, says the only thing that we can say with absolute certainty about a generation from now is that it'll be more diverse than now, about any society anywhere. That's the only trend that without fail is going to continue sociologically, is things are becoming more diverse. So here in the US, fewer than half Americans are white and Christian. There's a great book by, I'm blanking on his name, but The End of White Christian America, that sort of charts the way in which the norm of Protestant white, it's Robert, do you know who I'm talking about? Yeah, he's the head of PRRI. Anyway, I'll think of it. So that sort of, the notion of, as recently as FDR, who, great liberal champion, said, America is a Protestant country, the rest of you all here under suffrage. Like, basically, this is a white Protestant country, and we let some other people in to be nice. But that's what he said. That is changing, right? Like, that actually represents less than half of the country now. More than a third of 18 to 29-year-olds are now nuns. This was this famous, or I guess depending if you're a religion nerd or not, study from Pew on, so the question was, how do you identify religiously? And there's a whole bunch of boxes, and increasingly folks are checking nun, which is not the same as saying that folks are not religious and or spiritual, right? Still, overwhelming percentages of the country believe in God, believe in some sort of like binding moral code. It's just how they affiliate. So there's some interesting sociological data on this. So Robert Putnam, who I already mentioned, has studied this a lot and shown that actually, a lot of us, including me, grew up with this notion that like diversity is a good thing, right? We want to promote diversity, yay diversity, whatever. Putnam actually decided, okay, let's like study it and see what diversity actually does. Left unattended, diversity leads to rising tension and isolation. On its own, diversity actually leads to, so the phrase that Putnam uses is turtling. That when you live in a community that is becoming increasingly diverse, the natural human tendency is not, it's not actually, a lot of sociologists thought the reaction was to sort of circle the bandwagons, right? To like stick to your own clan or group more. It's actually not what happens. When communities and cultures become more diverse, what tends to happen is people just don't do anything. They just stay at home and watch Netflix. They tend to go out less. Seriously, this is what he showed, that they volunteer less. They even, they engage even with their own group less. The effect of diversity is actually just isolation. Ashutosh Varshney, who did a major study in South Asia, he was looking at why is it that when religious tensions flare, some towns and cities with both Muslim and Hindu populations erupt in like horrific mob violence, and other towns with comparable sort of proportions of Muslim Hindu communities stay peaceful and calm? And do you know, so the answer is kind of on here, but it was actually more specific than this. Do you know what the single biggest factor was? It was soccer leagues. It was whether the soccer league in the town was integrated between the Muslim and the Hindu community. If the Muslim and the Hindu community had their own separate soccer league, then when tensions flared, they tended to devolve in violence. If there was an integrated soccer league and Rotary Club, then they stayed calm. So basically, this isn't rocket science, but it is empirically backed that if you know people from a different religious background, if you have the opportunity to form relationships with them, you're less likely to gonna kill them, and that's a good thing, I would suggest. So, and this is connected to Putnam and Campbell, so same Putnam. People develop relationships across the lines of religious difference because of other shared interests. So that principally actually, the way you form these connections, you don't go in these towns that Varshney was studying. It's not let's have an interfaith dialogue per se, it's let's form a soccer league, and then it turns out that if we integrate the soccer league, then the Muslim and the Hindu kids get to know each other, they realize they come from different backgrounds, they begin to talk about it, but that they're not there principally necessarily to have an interfaith dialogue, they're there to play soccer. Putnam and Campbell use this example in the book of, it's like the most random thing ever, of beekeeping. That if you get involved in beekeeping with your friend Al, who's also interested in beekeeping, and then you realize Al's a Mormon. So, the reason why I'm explaining this is it's this theory called the My Pal Al theory. Once you realize that Al is Mormon, then your opinion of Mormons as a whole goes up. So knowing one person, this is the point, knowing one person from a different religious community and having a positive sense of who that person is increases your positive attitude towards, first of all, everyone in that community. So if you know just one Jewish person, hopefully my presentation here today will cause you to have more positive attitudes toward, I'm not saying I'm the first Jewish person you met, I'm just saying, towards that entire group, and significantly, and again, this is all empirically backed, towards diversity in general. Actually, you can just meet one person who's different than you, and not only will and if assuming that interaction goes well, not only will your attitudes towards that person's community go up, your attitudes towards all diversity goes up from having one positive relationship. So this gets to where IFYC tries to make our interventions in the world. So it's the recognition that actually comes from Diana Eck, who's a scholar of religion and many other things at Harvard, that actually diversity and pluralism are two different things, right? So diversity, Eck argues, is just a descriptive fact. The diversity is the existence of multiple different kinds of people inhabiting the same space. But as we were talking about earlier, Belfast is a very diverse place, Baghdad is a very diverse place, Boston is a very diverse place. It doesn't actually tell you about what the nature of those interactions are. So Eck contrasts that with pluralism, which is the active and positive engagement with difference toward the common good. So what IFYC exists to do is to transform diversity, which exists and is increasing, into pluralism, to the positive interaction amongst different communities. And we think you do that through interfaith cooperation, which is the sort of three principles of respect for religious identity. I don't need to agree with you. I can think you're morally wrong. I can actually actively work against you or the things that you want to have happen in society, but I still respect that you get the right to be you and to think what you think and advocate for what you advocate for. And I'm going to maintain a relationship with you. I'm going to maintain a relationship across lines of difference, across lines of fundamental disagreement, and we're going to figure out ways to work for the common good. So I might think you are entirely wrong on immigration policy, and I might spend 40 hours a week opposing what you advocate for when it comes to immigration policy, but I'm still going to find 3 hours a week to work with you on some other issue that we agree on, and that's pluralism. Does that make sense? Yep, great. I already talked about this a little bit, but this is this basic notion that these three concepts are positively correlated. So the more relationships you have with people who are different, the more likely you are going to have positive attitudes about people from that community, and you're more likely you are going to be to learn about those communities. The more you learn, the more likely you are going to have relationships and attitudes. So the job of interfaith leaders, simply put, is to help people walk around this triangle, is to find and design activities, whether they're explicitly interfaith dialogues or not, that enable people to sort of just go round and around and around this triangle, to learn more about other communities, to develop relationships with people who are different from them, to develop positive attitudes towards them. Yeah, so this is the part of the presentation where we learn that IFYC is secretly Trinitarian, because we have like all these like threes. Yeah, there's nothing new there. What is worth noting is that we're advocating for what we call civic pluralism, which is not theological pluralism. It's not epistemological pluralism, it's civic pluralism. It's about the ways in which we live and engage with each other in the broad socio-political spheres of common life. So it's not about agreeing about where we're all gonna go when we die. I mean, I already said a lot of this, or agreeing on any particular political or social policy or theological concept. It's the recognition that even if we disagree on all those things, our kids can be on the same soccer teams, we can be on the same PTAs, we can go to the same hospital, we can be treated by the same nurses, and we can live and work together in society. Right. Yeah, I think we've covered most of that. So just again to recognize that many people, when they talk about pluralism, are sort of referring to it in a theological sense. So I'm sure some of us have heard the notion of, like all religions are true, or different paths up the same mountain, or any sort of variation on that. And just to note that even though that the word pluralism is often used in those contexts, that's not really what we mean when we talk about civic pluralism at Interfaith Youth Corps. I don't know, have any of you read Stephen Prothero, God is Not One? I mean, I'm sure the religion scholars in the room have. But he sort of takes on this notion about specifically the many paths up. Have folks heard that many paths up the mountain? Different religions are all sort of getting at truth, the same truth in different ways. And Prothero, who's a scholar of religion at Boston University, is sort of pointing out that's actually not only analytically wrong, but it's actually kind of dangerous. Like actually, it presumes that there is a truth, a singular truth, and that we're all preoccupied with achieving it, and that actually different religious systems and different worldviews in general are trying to do different things. And maybe sometimes they're in alignment, and maybe sometimes that's true, but in a general sense, it's disrespectful to assume that actually what you're doing in your life is just a different way of getting at whatever it is that I'm trying to do in my life, and that we need to recognize that there is actually radical difference there. Okay, I'm going to pause there because I went over. I'm going to open it up to questions and comments and disputations, and then we'll see where we're at 1:30. Yeah?
I'd like to give them an opportunity to applaud you right now. Before we do that. Let's give them...
Thank you.
Now we have time at least till 1:30 for Q&A. And if we don't have any questions, then we can break. Or take it to carrots.
Yeah, nobody took me up on my offer.
I have a question. So what suggestions can you offer for how we can encourage this type of thinking and these types of discussions in a culture and political climate where our major institutions and people in positions of power and authority are actively encouraging divisiveness and discrimination?
Yeah, I had the same question.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think, I think one of the, this last point here, I think one of the most nefarious and pernicious things about our current political climate is the drive towards purity, the sort of need to be 100% aligned on anything, and the desire on both the political right and left, I got one, thank you, to like drive out heretics, right? So descriptively, I think our culture spends a lot more time arguing with people who largely agree with us, whatever side we're on, but who like are 5 degrees off and trying to expel them from the circle of woke folks or from the circle of true conservatives or the circle of, whatever it is. And I think that's really bad for democracy. I think, so part of what I think interfaith cooperation is suggesting, in addition to the more explicitly religious aspects of it and the particular salience of religious identity in particular, is just the notion that actually there is a civic good to be had in engaging with people who you disagree on things that you do agree. And that is actually a worthwhile and necessary part of civic life and democratic life. And whether that is even across lines of religious difference or not, it's necessary. So your question was like, how do you do that? I do think there's a big part of this that is on the sort of level of rhetoric and narrative. Like I think the stories that we tell on all levels matter a lot. And so part of what IFYC does is on like the level of media and national, like tries to tell a different story. So part of the story that I just told, there's a lot of stories you can tell about American history. There are a lot of stories you can tell about American history vis-a-vis diversity or religious identity. I think it's really important to tell the story that actually we are this amazing experiment of different religious communities working together and living together. That is a story that needs to be told and amplified. I think that's an important story to tell. And then I think there are, so when we get more into like the curricular interfaith studies, I think there are concrete ways that this can actually be taught in classrooms and in church groups and in other civic institutions. But I think the desire to, the need to resist the like I'm with you or against you mindset in all areas. But it's hard because it's overwhelming. I mean, I was just at a conference and, well, I'll save that story. It's not, yeah.
I mean, does that get Yeah, I mean, that's one of the challenges we have with teaching is like, how do we, approach issues where you're trying to encourage students to kind of respect diversity and appreciate the different perspectives that people bring to the table, but there's often kind of like an anxiety about even bringing these things up because you don't want to offend people at the same time,
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So a colleague of ours, Rahuldeep Gill, wrote an article on, I always get it. It was like from safe spaces to brave spaces to resilient spaces or something. I mean, so this like sort of evolving rhetoric. And it's talking about how one of the things, he's a professor of religion at California Lutheran, that one of the things he tries to do in his classroom is not create a safe space in the sense of like you are safe from being offended or encountering stuff that you disagree with, but that a resilient space where or maybe he's, whatever, it doesn't matter the terminology. But the point is, how do you create an atmosphere in which people are willing to offend and be offended, but do that with in a communal context? So the story that he tells, which I think is really funny, is he's got this diverse classroom, and over the course of a semester, a couple students are coming out as LGBTQ, and other students are sharing that they're undocumented, and at the end of the semester, one student says, I really need to come out, I voted for Trump. And everybody's like, oh, it's okay. I mean, and so, but the joke being, and I'm not trying, I mean, truly, vote however you want to vote. Point is, how do you create an environment in your class where people can be fully who they are, including supporting whatever political candidate that they support, but do that in a way where even the people who are diametrically opposed to that viewpoint recognize them as a member of the community of the classroom. And I think that's really hard, and I think it's really important. This is maybe a whole other can of worms. I think one of the things that really works against that right now is social media. I think the notion of college classrooms is sort of being practiced for the public, which is how it was for me as a student, right? This is a place where I get to try out ideas, some of which are really bad and stupid, but I'm trying them out in this like relatively safe environment, and then I learn, oh, that was a really dumb thing to say or do. Is challenged if like I say something stupid in class and somebody else tweets it. Like that's, that has a real silencing and chilling effect.
I mean, that's what I was thinking, was chilling effect. I mean, that's, in criminal justice, I don't know how to talk about the things we need to talk about without getting into those really kind of murky and scary waters of, is a student going to take this the wrong way, or is a student going to say something that offends other students? But at the same time, you also run into the problem of, well, what about just an environment where students want to speak up, but they feel like they can't because they'll be judged, or because they'll be, seen as a divisive force in the classroom or offending somebody else. So it's this constant balancing act between needing to talk about these really important issues and trying to find a way to do so that encourages, open discussion that's, I guess, respectfully offensive. I'm not sure, kind of how else to put it. That we can kind of agree to disagree, but also, we have to have these conversations somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna.
Well, I think you hit it on the nose when you say it's important, but it's difficult because I remember a time in a world history class when we were talking about something very difficult, and the student was obviously having trouble with it, so I was trying to create an analogy, and so it was an issue of religion, and I said, well, do you have a religious belief? She took so much offense at that question because I wasn't supposed to ask her that question. Right. And so this was at another institution, and the dean talked to me. She went and talked to the dean, and the dean said, "You probably should never ask that question." So I don't think a lot of us would feel really comfortable in a classroom asking a student about their religious persuasion or beliefs or things like that. And so it's important, yes, because if you want to cross this line to get to what you described up here on the screen, we have to have those sorts of conversations. So how do you have those conversations in academia now when, for lack of a better term, it's so touchy and people are running and screaming and saying, you can't ask me those sorts of questions? It's as if it has to be a safe zone. I could care less about whether I offend a student or not if they learn.
Right.
But I don't need the hassle of every time I try to get students to crack a little bit, they go running to a dean and I have to go deal with that.
Yeah.
So it's this difficult situation that I think all of us are in when we're trying to deal with these sorts of issues.
Well, what do some of the students in the room, what are thoughts you have on that?
I think it's
Okay, great. Can you write that down and sign it?
No, I mean, do you, regardless of your personal sense, I mean, do you get a sense that in your classrooms that there's a reluctance to speak openly or freely?
I would say so. I agree also. Just because I know for myself, it's times whenever I want to, a bunch of times throughout my years here at West End, I want to speak up, but then I look around, like, I really don't want to upset people and they change the whole image of me. And it's like, I just want to express one opinion.
Yeah.
So people know when their opinions are going to usually.
Yeah,
So a lot of the times, you don't say things you want to say because you know how it's going to be reacted.
And usually it's not really the professor that responds. Usually when a student says something, it's the other students that like gang tackle the student that said something. And then the professor has to play mediator.
One class I teach is ethics, and that is great because I make it clear, no slurs, no screaming, no bad language. And we too, with stormy things like, say, Dr. Kevorkian assisted suicide, everyone gets to have their say-so. I won't tell them what I think, but I say everyone has their say-so, and they learn how to agree to disagree politely. They only slug each other once, you know. But no, it's things like, I insist on that, and knowledge makes such a difference. If you say, I believe that, why? That's like Socrates, you know. And they have to defend their beliefs at that point, but also they learn how to see the different viewpoints. And when that kind of interaction occurs, and the times I've taught ethics, I've always been great classes. They love it because they get a chance to express their opinion. They may not get everyone to agree, but everyone knows where they stand and they still leave peaceably. Yeah. And that I think is great.
Yeah, I mean, so the two concrete things I would say. So one, Dr. McDonald, did I get that right? Yeah, so one of it is, I think, setting expectations, which I'm sure you all do, right? So, I mean, Ibu has this metaphor about interfaith leadership as being a mountain climber. You don't get to the mountain and say, what the heck are you doing here, right? Like, you expect it to be hard, right? So saying at the outset, we are engaging with controversial issues on which we are going to have different opinions. We are all going to be offended. If you go through this class and you do not have some of your notions challenged or hear things that you vehemently disagree with, then I have failed you as a professor. This class has failed you. Like, this isn't an educational environment unless those things happen. So setting some of the context, and I mean, and I don't know. I mean, you're raising the issue of sort of institutional policies and whatnot. And I obviously don't know. I mean, it varies from institution to institution and whatnot. And there is, I think, a role for the administration to play in some of this. But saying, like, if you don't want to sign up for that, then don't sign up for this, right? This is what we do here, is the hard work of these controversial issues and wrestling with them. So that, I do think, goes a fair amount of way, because I think there are lots of students who want these opportunities. I mean, sometimes it's the minority but shrillest voices that have the chilling effect, right? It's not necessarily representative of the majority. But the other thing, which is maybe more concrete and tactical, is we have found that case studies are a great sort of pedagogical tool for a lot of this, because it provides enough, I mean, for a lot of reasons, but as to this point, it provides enough of a sense of removal from personal opinion to get around some of this, what are people going to think of me if I say this, whatever. So you present, I mean, in criminal justice, there's obviously tons of examples, but you present a real life case, and then you assign people to inhabit the different perspectives in the case. And so it teaches perspective taking, It teaches responsibility and leadership. You have to make a decision. Something needs to be done. You can't just punt on this, right? Like, and there's frequently going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser. But so what are the issues that are at play? What are the moral considerations you take? But if you're then, I'm trying to think of some of the cases that we've done recently. This was a few years ago, but the Secular Student Alliance had this campaign after the Danish cartoon. This was now, 10, 15 years ago, the Everybody Draw Muhammad Day. So in response to the Danish cartoons, and then people got, elements of the Muslim community got really upset about that, and so in support of free speech, secular student groups around the country did Everybody Draw Muhammad Day in support of free speech. Obviously Muslim students really offended. You're the chaplain, you're the dean of students. What are you gonna do? How do you resolve this? How do you try and facilitate conversation between these two groups? Do you let the event happen? Do you not? So there's a decision you need to make. You're responsible. But then it also enables people to inhabit different perspectives that they may or may not personally hold and speak from those viewpoints, which sometimes gets around some of this, like, well, if I say what I really think, so there's enough pretense now, it's not what you think, it's what the character you're playing.
Vicariously.
Yeah. And so sometimes that works. You were just talking about, some of the transformations that you've witnessed in your class of various students. I don't know if you have thoughts on.
Well, all the same techniques that we're talking about, but the tone setting, I spend a lot of time with tone setting at the beginning of the semester, and in terms of setting up the mountain. That's the metaphor of the journey, the stories I was telling you. And I tend not to call out students directly quite like that. I more ask really open-ended, what if, what might someone with a religious belief or things like that. That's what's coming up. Things that are coming to mind now.
Yeah. Please, Jake.
I was going to say what has helped in a lot of my classes is that the professor is very, very unbiased towards anything. So sometimes even unknowingly, professors take things without even a comment here or there, or their tone of voice when they speak about something. It comes across. And then that immediately will give a certain group of people in that class, I don't want to say anything, right? So it helps obviously just remaining unbiased. And then even presenting both viewpoints in a positive light. So showing the perspective of both, say, politics, one side and the other side, and telling them why they giving perspectives for each opinion. And it's helped me in my classes to have other people kind of speak out, myself speak out. Because I'm a people pleaser, I like to say things that's going to offend people. But if I feel like the professor is on my side and he's explaining things, or she is explaining things to the class that I'm not going to have to explain, and I can take a stance. I can say what I want to say. That's just me.
It's interesting as a professor because sometimes students will just point blank ask us what our belief systems are.
Yeah.
And you never know when these moments are going to come. But for example, in doing this for a long 20 years or so, I've had students ask me, well, what's your opinion about the death penalty? Mm-hmm. That's here we go.
Yeah.
And so usually I respond to that kind of what you're suggesting of I give them the truth about what my opinion is, but I also say, throughout the course of my life, that opinion has shifted. The more I've studied it, I've been on both sides.
Yeah.
But I also say, this is my opinion now, but I can teach a course an entire semester on why my opinion's wrong and why there's another side to things. So I think that's really important. Like Chad was suggesting, setting the tone setting. I think that's a great phrase to use. That we as the instructors have to set the tone, and not just by how we discuss things with you, but by having pedagogical interventions or techniques where we come in and we teach you critical thinking skills, or we explain the rationale behind how you actually come to form an opinion by studying both sides of things, giving you in-class exercises and things like that. And maybe that helps create a culture where you feel that the professor's unbiased, or at least trying not to. At least trying to be upfront and honest about biases, which I think is important as well.
Yeah, I think the question of, I appreciate obviously what you're saying, Jacob. I think it's challenging, right? Because sometimes as I hear you saying, sometimes the best way to avoid the bias of the professor is just to acknowledge it out front, right? Like, I mean, so I know in places where I'm in the role of an educator, like I just try and own, like, this is where I'm coming from. These are my, these are my proclivities. But then what I'm trying to do is always represent whatever the minority perspective is. So if the class is all moving this way, then I'm going to try and represent this other viewpoint, and vice versa. So, yeah.
Yes. This has nothing to do with what we're talking about now, but what you're talking about. What was the name you gave it, Fred and Jim? If they're Muslim and Jewish and they play the soccer game together forever.
My pal Al?
Yeah, my pal Al. What do you do when someone says, like I'm about to say, with the disintegration of Yugoslavia in the 1990s? Because there's an interview I was using when I teach American history, and we talk about that in the 1990s. And there's a particular hospital in Sarajevo where they had Muslim doctors and Christian doctors who have been working side by side for generations, and they interview a nurse and two doctors, and one's Muslim, one's Jewish, and one's Christian, and they say great things about how they grew up together, et cetera, and now they at that point they literally hated each other, and if he came over to my house, I would kill him and all of his children. And with Israel-Palestine as well, you have, or the former Soviet Union, you have these groups that have gotten along since at least 1945, you could say, minimum. And now with nationalism, they're literally, a lot of places, they hate each other. The whole reason that there's peace in Kosovo is because there are NATO troops on the ground there. It's just a I'm wondering question. It's not a I want to destroy your theory.
No, it's not my theory. Take it up with Putnam. So first of all, I think you're making a bigger point than this, but the my pal Al thing can work in reverse, right? So you have one negative experience with somebody, and suddenly, like, everyone in that community is seen through that same lens. But you're actually talking about something more complicated, which is you've built the positive relationships, and still, the broader context shifts to the point where it doesn't matter. So there's this interesting study done by Sharif called The Robber's Cave, where they took, it's like one of these things that you could do in the 1950s that you could never do now. They took a bunch of kids to a camp, and they divided them into like two bunks, like I don't even remember what they were, like the eagles and the bears or whatever. And there's a bunch of sociologists who were doing this, and they basically designed a bunch of different experiments that first got these kids to absolutely hate each other, and then a bunch of other things that got them to work cooperatively, and then to hate each other again. And so basically, and they were, it's like kind of Machiavellian. They were pulling all these strings. But what the study shows is that all behavior is sort of context dependent. And so if the social context is one in which is overwhelmingly such that these two communities are at each other's throats, then even histories of positive relationship and whatever aren't necessarily going to withstand that. There's other research that shows that it's not enough to just actually have the relationship. You need to actually bring the element of difference into the relationship. So I don't know these interviews you're talking about in Sarajevo, but it's even if they were working together, but if they never actually really talked about their explicit differences, if they never talked about why as a Christian or as a Muslim they were called to be doctors or they were called to heal people, right? If you never actually bring the aspect of difference in, a lot of this comes from race relations in this country too, right? If you don't actually bring the aspect of difference into the relationship, then the relationship.
That's actually, that makes a lot of sense. I can give you an example to support that. So good answer. Because I lived in Kuwait for 8 years, and it's, in terms of the population that's Kuwaiti, not in terms of the half of the population that's expat, It's about roughly 50-50 Shia and Sunni. And I do oral history, and in interviewing people, growing up in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, we loved each other, we got along, we didn't even ask any questions about religion. But then after the 1979 revolution in Iran, all of a sudden, Daddy told me that my friends are Shia, and now it's quite tense, and has been tense ever since 1979, really. So that actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And don't you think so much of that is driven by fear?
It is fear, but it
gets
back to what he said, that they didn't know. I had so many people tell me, I didn't know what Shia was or Sunni was. We were just Muslims.
But that's the point, is that's how the political and socio-political structures that ensure that the propagandized version of this person that I fear is going to take my resources away from me, right? I want to make sure you are really angry about them. And then there's the whole epigenetic studies about how one generation's method of dealing with their anxiety, fears, and worries is actually carried on in future generations. It makes perfect sense as to why some of these are generations-long conflicts, right?
Yeah.
So for me, it's so much, you talk about the Machiavellian sort of, isn't that what we experience all the time? I need these resources, and I want to have more of these resources, and these people can't have these resources. Therefore, I'm going to stoke fear and worry and anger in the people I need to fight against those folks, right? We're experiencing it every day, and it's gone on for centuries, right?
Oh, I thought you were talking about President Trump.
I am. I'm talking about all of it.
Thank you both. I think it just underscores how difficult and precarious this is, and how intentional it has to be. That it really requires an intentional commitment to say, I'm going to work hard to do. And this gets to your question too. I think part of what is incumbent on you as a professor, but also on your students, is to say, I'm going to work hard at this. I am going to deal with being offended, with being, my buttons being pushed, because there's a greater good that can be achieved through doing this hard and difficult work. And I think the challenge for us is, how do you extend the invitation in such a way that people are willing to cross that bridge? I don't know what metaphor I'm using now, but that are willing to do the hard work. Because for lots of reasons, including genetics, I'd love to learn more about that. There's always the instinct to say, no, I'm going to stay at home and watch Netflix, right? I'm not going to deal with this.
There's
nothing wrong with Netflix, by the way.
I'm just now kind of familiarizing myself with the literature of this professionally, but it's something I'm already trying to bring into my classes, which is the neurological underpinnings of how beliefs are formed, how biases are formed, and kind of speaking to what you were talking about in terms of, why is it that you can have these positive relationships that all of a sudden, kind of turn sour? And there seems to be a growing body of evidence that suggests that when we have negative experiences, they take a greater cognitive, a priority in our brains to kind of push us down a belief system of, if you have a good experience, that's great, and it warm fuzzies and all that kind of thing, and that might lead to positive social relationships. But when you have a negative experience with another person, that tends to have a much more predominant influence on their cognitive frameworks of how they understand their social relationships and how they put people in categories. And so that's something. Christian, you've been in my classes. That's something that every single one of my classes I try to bring in something of the neurology of belief and how the brain works and how that might, kind of subconsciously be encouraging us to have conflict when maybe we're just in some important ways kind of exaggerating our responses to the social experiences that we have.
Well, our brains actually are hardwired to pay attention to the negative and with far greater attention, because it is all about survival.
Yeah, and hopefully the students appreciate it. It's fascinating.
Hard work, positive experiences. Those were my two takeaways from that. So hopefully this has been a positive experience, and hopefully you will go forth from here wanting to do the good and hard work of engaging with interfaith dynamics and to try to become an interfaith leader.